Thank you so much, Professor Arnold. We are going to open up the floor after the speakers have completed their presentations for questions and answers. So I know you'll want to definitely speak to some of the speakers. The next speaker that we're honored to have with us is Professor Mary MacDonald from Moyne College, who is a theologian and has taken up some leadership roles in writing and lectures on the doctrine of discovery. Please welcome Professor MacDonald.
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you to all of you for coming this evening. As Tanya mentioned, I teach at Moyne College in Syracuse, New York, a college that is in the Jesuit tradition. I actually grew up in Australia, though, and I'd never heard about the doctrine of discovery until I came to the United States. I had heard as a child in school in Australia and then in high school and university, I had heard about terra nullius, the notion of empty land, a notion that goes back to Roman law, the expression terra nullius implying that if people came upon land that was not occupied by others, then they may take over that land. In the context of Australia, this was taken to mean that, well, the land wasn't exactly empty. There were some people there, not a huge amount of people, but there were people there, but they were not using the land in ways that civilized people might use the land. They were not farming, they were not engaged in big agricultural enterprises. And in any case, terra nullius was used as a justification for taking over the land. So when I did get to hear about the doctrine of discovery, I realized that the two doctrines had a lot in common in that they were both justifications on the part of European powers for taking over the land of indigenous peoples. As Phil Arnold has mentioned, the Doctrine of Discovery study group in Syracuse began a bit over 5 years ago. At that time, Phil and I were already including material on the Doctrine of Discovery in courses that we were teaching, he at Syracuse University and I at Moyne College. Oren Lyons and Steve Newcomb and Bob Miller and other Indigenous leaders and scholars had for quite some time been discussing the stumbling block, or worse, something more like a boulder, that the doctrine of discovery constitutes in relationships between indigenous peoples and settler peoples. It has caused great suffering and damage, and it makes it difficult for us to all work together. So it really injures all of us. Starting small, and as academics, Phil and I thought that a study group might be a good way to go. And so we arranged to have monthly discussion groups where we could educate ourselves, could share ideas, and could lend support to the efforts to repudiate the doctrine of discovery. We decided to read books and articles and to discuss them. I'll reflect on our reading and also on our teaching of college students about the doctrine of discovery. So with regard to reading for the monthly meetings, we often start a book intending to read it in parts over several months, but then we may become involved in other things that are going on in the community. So sometimes it'll take us a while to get through a book. For example, when we were discussing paradigm wars, we were at the same time following events leading up to the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. After the adoption, we followed the discussion in Australia and then later in and then later as Canada and the US, countries that had initially refused to sign on to the declaration decided to do so. Similarly, we were all involved in a year-long series of events on Onondaga land rights and our common future, and so often our meetings during that year would reflect those events. I want to mention some of the books and documents we've discussed together, and there is a list of those on the table at the back of the room. However, it's not only the reading that's important. The process of getting together in person at our monthly meetings, and also in conversation on the listserv that Phil mentioned, getting together to explore the history and present reality of the relationship of Indigenous peoples and settler peoples helps us all in becoming allies, in working together. Those of us who have met together have become friends as well as allies. At first, we used to meet in a seminar room at the Warehouse, a downtown building belonging to Syracuse University. And the last year or so, we've been meeting at the home of Bill Arnold and Sandy Bigtree. Once in a while, we've met at my house too. Meeting in a house, I think, makes it easier to serve refreshments, and it creates a comfortable space. The group includes Haudenosaunee members and people of settler backgrounds, academics, professional people, people who like to read and discuss. There are lots of different ways, I think, to work on the relationship of Indigenous peoples and settler peoples, and for those from both groups who are into reading and discussion, the kind of group we have is one way to go. But there may be lots of other ways to go too, and we heard about the work of Moyne. We don't always agree in the group, but we are committed to hearing each other and hearing the often challenging voices that come to us through our reading. As I think back over the years that we've been together, I'm grateful for the support the group has given to all of us as we try to live and to teach in authentically human ways. I ponder with sadness and also with gratitude on the lives of two of our first members who have gone before us. Dorothy Webster, a clan mother of the Eel clan of the Onondaga Nation, who had a fierce commitment to the environment and who told things as she saw them. And Frank Woolliver, a Catholic peace activist, a gentle man who had served prison time for opposing the US School of the Americas. It was a privilege to learn from them and along with them. The books and documents we read make us aware that the struggles and the hopes of Indigenous peoples, which we see played out among our neighbours at the Onondaga Nation, are part of the larger process of colonialism and globalization. Let me mention a few of our texts to indicate how texts can propel us to solidarity and engagement. Paradigm Wars was one of the first books we read together, edited by Jerry Manda and Victoria Talley-Corpus. The book contains reports and reflections by 25 writers, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, on the collision of worldviews that occurred with the European discovery of foreign lands, of Indigenous lands. It helped us to hear the voices of Indigenous communities faced with extractive industries and other threats to their survival. In our early meetings, as I mentioned, we followed the progress of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and since then we've watched efforts towards its implementation. When the UN issued a report in 2009 on the state of the world's Indigenous peoples, we spent several meetings discussing its 7 sections on poverty and well-being, culture, environment, contemporary culture, health, human rights, and emerging issues. A number of meetings were also devoted to Original Instructions, a volume edited by Melissa Nelson, which has a section on the eco-spiritual values of the original instructions Indigenous communities received from their ancestors. Something very important to get hold of, because there you find the worldview of the group. A section on Indigenous democracies that Chief Jake Edwards referred to, and a section on the art and science of kinship. Often we read articles from Indian Country Today, so it's good to have Gail with us this evening, giving us a picture of what is happening across Indian country and what unites Indigenous communities. Sometimes we read sermons, such as A Call for Justice for Indigenous Peoples by John Diefenbacher Krau, pastor of an Episcopal church in Maine. It's good, on the one hand, reading a sermon, to see church people recognize the tragedy caused by the doctrine of discovery, and to see them commit themselves and their churches to justice and faithful living of gospel values. It's, on the other hand, heartrending to read papal bulls such as Dum Diversas, Romanus Pontifex, and Inter Cetere, which show church and state in collusion to acquire the resources of Indigenous peoples. Several Indigenous scholars have devoted themselves to the study of the origins of the doctrine of discovery, and among their works we've read Robert Miller's Native America, Discovered and Conquered, Steve Newcomb's Pagans in the Promised Land, and sections of Walter Echo Hawke's In the Courts of the Conqueror. Our book of the moment is 1493, Uncovering the New World Columbus Created by Charles Mann, a book that explores the Columbian Exchange. A word on teaching. Phil and I both teach college students, and he also teaches graduate students. Obviously, we think that it is important to discuss the age of discovery, the papal bulls and other charters, the history of the European settlement of Indigenous lands, and where we are as a global community now. It is important to discuss these things with students at every level. Yet they are troubling matters, and we risk alienating students. It's painful, for example, for Christian students at Moyne, where I teach, to reflect on the history of their church and to see not always a following of the way of Jesus, but often a lending of support to the colonizing schemes of European powers. So for teachers, it is a challenge to impart information and to encourage reflection without demonizing our students, who are often quick to tell us that they were not around during the age of discovery. They are, though, part of the age of globalization, and that can be terrifying too. I don't think students have an easy time of it, to be honest. So I'm always a little wary in the way I go about teaching. Of course, whether our ancestors have been in the same place for thousands of years, or whether ourselves or parents or grandparents came from elsewhere, we all, settler peoples and Indigenous peoples, are sharing the Americas, Oceania, and other regions of the world today. I think there is a challenge to justice in that. We're all trying to find a way to give everyone a fair go. We all need some place to be, and we all need to be there in a way that will respect the rights of Indigenous peoples and also provide for the human rights of all of us. So, in our teaching, I think our emphasis has to be not only on information, but also on values, on formation for social justice. I hope that Phil and I have been able to share with you something of the process of the Doctrine of Discovery group and of our outlook as teachers. We would, of course, be glad to respond to questions after Friedrich has added over now. Thank you.